Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this webinar session to mark the International Day commemorating the victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief. My name is Evelina Ohab, and I'm the co-founder of the Coalition for Genocide Response. I'm joined by my colleague Anton De Piro and a distinguished panel of experts that I will introduce shortly. In May 2019, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution establishing the International Day commemorating the victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief, to be marked on 22nd of August. The day is intended to provide a springboard towards an action plan that addresses the growing issue of violence based on religion or belief. The establishment of such a day is not the end goal in itself. It is just the beginning of a larger campaign that ultimately aims to put an end to violence based on religion or belief, whenever and wherever it occurs. Indeed, only in the last few years, we have witnessed several cases of mass atrocities based on religion or belief that arguably meet the legal definition of international crimes, including genocide in Article 2 of the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. In 2014, in Syria and Iraq, Daesh, a non-state actor consisting of local and international terrorists, launched a genocidal campaign against religious minorities like Yazidis, Christians, and others they consider non-believers or infidels. In 2016, the Burmese military's attacks on the Rohingya Muslim civilians in Rakhine State have led to forced displacement of over 700,000 members of the community to neighboring Bangladesh. Over the recent years, Boko Haram and Fulani militia and other non-state actors have been waging war on infidels, Christians, but also Muslims who they consider not to adhere to their ideologies. In those three cases, the perpetrators have resorted to killings, physical and mental abuse, rape and sexual violence, enslavement, torture and inhuman degrading treatment, forcible transfer of populations as weapon of war on the targeted communities. In those three cases, they attempted to annihilate the communities in whole or in part. However, recent years have also seen more sophisticated and subtle methods of bringing about mass atrocities that are less glaring to the eye. Indeed, in China, the Chinese Communist Party has developed ways to strip religious minorities of their religious identity in the so-called re-education camps for Uyghur Muslims. This was followed by reports of Uyghur Muslims being subjected to forced labor. Other reports indicated that Uyghur Muslim women have been forcibly sterilized, which resulted in a drop of births within the minority group by 80%. Despite having a significant effect upon the communities that may bring about the destruction in whole or in part. In this case, we did not see graphic photographs or videos of the bodies or injuries that would speak to our humanity and call us to act. However, those atrocities may lead to the annihilation of the Uyghur Muslim communities in China, in whole or in part, and so cannot be neglected. These recent cases of acts of violence based on religion or belief all happen after we promise never again, again and again. We need to do more, not only to address such atrocities by stopping them, assisting the survivors, ensuring justice, but also to ensure that such atrocities do not happen again without this being an empty promise. Today, you will hear from Lord Alton of Liverpool, peer at the UK House of Lords and patron of the Coalition for Genocide Response, Lord Ahmad of Wimbledon, Minister of State and Prime Minister's Special Representative on Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict, Ambassador Sam Brownback, US Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, Professor Ahmed Shahid, Professor at Essex Law School and UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Professor Maurice Tadros from the Coalition for Religious Equality and Inclusive Development, Institute of Development Studies, University of Sussex, and Nadine Maenza, Commissioner with the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. And now, without any further ado, we'll hear introductory remarks from Lord Alton of Liverpool.
Recent years have witnessed far too many egregious atrocities based on religion or belief, repeatedly perpetrated against vulnerable communities and even endangering their very existence. 2014 ushered in a new wave of truly shocking mass beheadings of so-called infidels. People were thrown from high buildings, prisoners burnt in metal cages, women raped and homes looted. These atrocities then intensified in their number and in their scope. On the 3rd of August 2014, Daesh attacked Sinjar, killing thousands of Yazidis, abducting thousands of women and girls, and forcing the rest to flee. The horror and continuing consequences of what they endured was again brought home to me when, a few months ago, I visited northern Iraq. The ferocious attacks on the Yazidis was followed by subsequent mass atrocities in the Nineveh plains, where Christians were forced to flee or die. Daesh was responsible for murder, enslavement, deportation, the forcible transfer of populations of women and children, forced marriage, and enforced disappearances. In a continuation of this gruesome danse macabre, these depredations have been followed by similar atrocities perpetrated by the Burmese military against the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, atrocities that have resulted in over 700,000 people fleeing to Bangladesh, thousands killed or injured. Those atrocities are being investigated by the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. Now we hear unfolding reports of arbitrary detention of over 1 million Uyghur Muslims in China, killings in detention, torture and inhumane treatment of detainees, the forced separation of children from their parents, forced sterilization, forced labor, forced organ harvesting, enforced disappearances, and much more besides. And let's not forget the neglected and ignored mass atrocities in Nigeria at the hands of Boko Haram and Fulani militia. Why do these Black African lives matter so little to commentators and policymakers, despite more and more evidence coming to light every day of the severity and the scope of these shocking atrocities? In all these cases, religious minorities are targeted because of their religion or belief. In every sense, all these atrocities perpetrated against religious minorities are crimes against humanity and even genocide, but to date, the United Kingdom government has signally failed to name these crimes for what they are and to take the actions laid upon them as a signatory to international conventions and law. Atrocities based on religion or belief happen in other parts of the world too, and often out of sight and out of mind. Take, for example, the 2014 United Nations Commission of Inquiry, which concluded that Christians in North Korea have been singled out for especially brutal treatment, and that this is, and these are the Commission's own words, a state that does not have any parallel in the contemporary world. The Commission said that the regime considers the spread of Christianity a particularly severe threat, and that what is happening resembles, their words, the horrors of camps that totalitarian states established during the 20th century. It concludes that no official or institution is held accountable because impunity reigns. That UN report said that there should be a referral to the International Criminal Court. 5 years later, though, fear of vetoes has meant that nothing has happened. We need to do more to ensure that we address all acts of violence based on religion or belief. This means investigating such acts. This means prosecuting the perpetrators. Further, this also means working to ensure that similar atrocities are prevented in the future. Over recent years, we have arguably witnessed 4 cases which meet the technical test of what constitutes a genocide, and most certainly crimes against humanity. We should know by now that we cannot continue this way. A change is undoubtedly needed in how we address such atrocities.
I would like to give the floor to our first speaker, Lord Ahmad of Wimbledon, UK Minister of State and Prime Minister's Special Representative on Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict. Lord Ahmad, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. And to begin with, may I convey my thanks to Lord Alton, to David, for all the work he does. I work very closely with him on a range of issues across the UK Parliament, and I pay tribute to his efforts in this respect, particularly on the issue of freedom of religion or belief, and to you as well, Evelina, for organising, and to the whole team for organising today's event. I'm extremely pleased to be with you to mark the second UN International Day commemorating the victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief. I'm sure I speak for everyone on this call. We'd rather all hope that there wouldn't be a need to convene a third such International Day, yet the facts of the matter are, sadly and tragically, I fear that we shall continue to meet for a number of years to commemorate this particular day. Last year, after co-sponsoring the resolution to establish this International Day, I myself traveled to New York to attend a meeting of the UN Security Council on advancing this very issue on the safety and security of people belonging to religious minorities in armed conflict. During that meeting, I delivered the following message on behalf of our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. He said, "The freedom of religion or belief is at the heart of what the United Kingdom stands for. We will do everything possible to champion these freedoms and protect civilians in armed conflict, including religious, ethnic, or other minorities. We are determined to use the tools of British diplomacy in this cause, including our permanent seat on the UN Security Council." To all who are on this call and beyond, this message stands true today, as it ever did. Defending freedom of religion or belief for all remains a major priority for Her Majesty's government. As the UK Minister responsible, amongst other things, for human rights, I've seen directly through meeting of survivors of such persecution firsthand how this issue has risen up the international agenda and how governments have responded accordingly, collaboratively coming together by increasing efforts to address violations of freedom of religion or belief. The UK has also stepped up our work internationally. We joined the new International Religious Freedom Alliance, and I'm delighted that we're joined today by Ambassador Brownback, and I pay tribute to the efforts of the United States, and in particular, his personal efforts in getting this alliance up and running. And this has allowed countries, like-minded partners, to work even more closely together to defend freedom of religion or belief for all. We continue to raise this important matter of freedom of religion or belief at the UN, including urging the international community to work together to face the challenges presented by COVID-19. It is indeed tragic to note that some are using the tragedy of the pandemic, that is COVID-19, to increase their persecution and targeting of religious minorities across the world. It is therefore particularly important at this time to ensure that the most vulnerable and the most disadvantaged members of society are actively included in response and recovery efforts. We are also addressing this directly in the UK through our own programme funding. The United Kingdom has been bringing all our foreign policy tools together to bear on this. And as many of you know, we are merging together the Foreign and Commonwealth Office with the Department for International Development, and we will bring together targeted programs on freedom of religion or belief. The first such example is an Institute of Development Studies project, which works with minority religious groups in both Africa and Asia, and to which £12 million has been allocated over the coming 4 years. The second program is run with the University of Oxford and has been allocated £5.5 million over 5 years. It will work with parliamentarians in 9 countries to diminish the use of religious language during elections, which is often used to intimidate minority religious groups and indeed voters in general. Many of you will know that we asked the Bishop of Truro to review what we, the UK, could do better to support the plight, particularly of persecuted Christians around the world. This, in my mind, was long, long overdue. The Bishop responded with a detailed report that underlined the grave extent of the issue we face, with 22 recommendations for an enhanced government response for people persecuted for holding other religious beliefs. The government, the United Kingdom government, has committed to implementing the recommendations in full. As a progress report, so far 11 of the recommendations have been or are in the process of being implemented, and this work is led by my colleague, the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion or Belief, Raman Chisti, who succeeded me in that role in September 2019. In August 2019, I also launched the John Bunyan Fund for FORB, In its first year, we have funded 15 research projects looking at the challenges faced by different communities, such as Christians, Yazidis, and humanists, as well as cross-cutting issues such as migration and the double vulnerability experienced by women from minority faith backgrounds. And this, in my mind, requires a special focus and a special effort. I'm also proud of the steps we have taken since this important day was established. And I know that many other countries have also taken some very significant steps to support those who are persecuted. Why? Simply for their religious beliefs. We have made progress, but there is so much more to be done. Promoting respect and understanding amongst different religious and non-religious communities requires a whole of society effort, including from non-government organizations, religious bodies, the media, civil society, and for everyone, an individual commitment to promote pluralism, tolerance, and respect. We have also brought together issues across government. As the Prime Minister's Special Representative on Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict, I'm especially proud to have worked with the religious leaders across the world and civil societies to issue a declaration of humanity, calling for an end to sexual violence in conflict and to tackle the stigma so tragically often faced by survivors, including children born of conflict-related sexual violence. This declaration is an important example of where multiple faiths and beliefs can unite in a common front to challenge damaging societal norms and demand support for survivors of sexual violence, and also to wrestle back the narrative. There are too many groups, too many organizations that operate in the world who hijack religion for their own means. We must take back the narrative. We must take back the narrative, erroneous narrative that they propagate about different religions. The declaration has received significant global support from faith and belief leaders, community leaders, and faith-based organizations in a vast range of countries, including Iraq, Sierra Leone, the Vatican, Kosovo, and indeed Sri Lanka, to name but a few. And I would encourage you all to show your support for the declaration, to give it yet greater, strong, and stronger support. In the course of my work, I have met many, many victims and survivors of faith-based violence and persecution, as all I know my co-panelists have done so as well. And I'm sure I speak for all of them, indeed, everyone on this call and beyond, who has met survivors of such persecution, of such violence. Their stories are often harrowing. They are tragic. Yet, through that tragedy, we see their strength, we see their courage, we see their dignity in telling these stories. It is most humbling, but what it does do, it fuels our collective resolve to stamp out faith-based violence and persecution. To conclude, it is vital that we give voice to their stories. It is vital we give a platform to allow them to express the challenges they face, the persecution that they have had to confront, but equally their ability, their will, and courage to survive. The freedom to choose and practice a religion or belief, or indeed to have no religion at all, is a fundamental human right, a fundamental universal human right, belonging to everyone, everywhere. No one at all should have to suffer for following their conscience. Our collective resolve and job should be to work together as nations, as faith and civil society leaders, and as a passionate advocate of freedom of religion or belief. I end with what I often articulate when it comes to standing up for religion, that the greatest test of our own religion or belief is when we stand up for the religion or belief of others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lord Ahmad. Thank you for explaining the work done by the UK and for mentioning, of course, the Declaration of Humanity. And we look forward to supporting and promoting it in our work. And now I would like to give the floor to Ambassador Sam Brownback, US Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. Ambassador Brownback, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. And thank you for organizing this event. And it's always an honor for me to join Lord Ahmed on a program and a panel. Lord Alden, David Alden, who I've known for many years in this fight for religious freedom. It's a pleasure to join you and others that are on this call and commemorating this day. This is a day we shouldn't have to commemorate. This is a basic fundamental human right. It was recognized in 1948 by the UN Declaration of Human Rights. It belongs to everybody, everywhere, all the time, and yet it's been in decline for the last several decades. And more people have been persecuted. And you heard Lord Alton talk about the various places around the world that this is taking place. And my hope is that the people on this line, when they hear these stories and they know about them, that these are chains that rub up against your flesh and that you feel it. John Brown was an abolitionist in the United States that really lit the match on the Civil War here to end slavery in the United States, the most costly war in the history of the United States that killed so many hundreds of thousands of Americans. But it was over a fundamental issue, and that was the issue of slavery. And it's so rubbed, and Brown would use this phrase, it was a biblical phrase, that the chains of those who are enslaved rub against my flesh. I feel it, and I can't stand it, and I'm going to do something about it. And that's what I feel like we have to do here. Many of us on this line have a faith orientation of one way or the other. And I love what Lord Ahmed said about, our standing should be, and our measure should be how much we stand up for a right of somebody else's faith. We aren't talking about a common theology. We're talking about a common human right. In my estimation, in our country, is a God-given human right for you to choose whatever faith it is or none at all. And we should feel the chains of those. Right now in this world today, a simple prayer by somebody is an act of courage. This is an act of courage that if they do this, they could be arrested. They could be thrown in jail. They could be tried and convicted and put in jail for many years or even put to death for the simple act of praying. And if we don't feel that, then we need to, I guess, get back to our own basics, to feel the common humanity that we stand up for. Many of us are leaders in our countries and certainly in this cause. And this is a cause that needs to be electrified, needs to be elevated. And it's one that I believe will help the entire Human Rights Project to grow and to thrive in a world that we've seen human rights in decline. So what can we do? I think we need both a grassroots movement and we need a global movement. The grassroots movement is we need local individuals to really fire up in their communities and to draw attention. There are people all over the world that have family members back that have been persecuted or know people or they themselves have been persecuted. And you can start these local religious freedom roundtables. I meet with the one in the United States every Tuesday at 11 o'clock. And we go through about issues that are taking place. And so we developed an action plans of things that we can do. And often one of the things we can start with in our own faith community is praying for people that are being persecuted for their faith around the world. There's some 30 of these that have been started. There need to be hundreds of them around the world to really get this grassroots movement going and an organic bottom-up lifting of this topic of religious freedom, freedom of religion or belief, as many would refer to it as. A second, if you're representing a country, Lord Ahmed talked about the alliance. There's an International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance that's been established. Some 30 countries are a part of it. If your nation isn't, we would invite you to be a part of it. These are the activists. These are the countries that are pushing, that want to bind together to see this fundamental human right be realized by people in the world. Unfortunately, the data we've got today is 80% of the world's community lives in a country where there's significant religious persecution, and the rights aren't able to be practiced by broad-based individuals. This alliance is a group of nations pushing to see that these rights are moved forward, and wanting to then use collective action by statements and by, if we need to do sanctions and other tools that can be available, using our development aid programs to push for religious freedom in these nations, raising it in international forums as this fundamental human right that it is. The Polish government is hosting the 3rd annual Ministerial for Religious Freedom taking place in November of this year. I urge people to attend. The civil society and the religious groupings meeting will be a virtual meeting. I think it's November 19th. The government meeting will be November 18th. I'm hoping nations can attend that one to continue to move forward the progress of nations focusing on this particular issue. And then finally, there's an interesting initiative of religious leaders called the Abrahamic Faith Initiative. That's a group of the Abrahamic faiths coming together to push and to stand up for each other's fundamental human rights wherever that's taking place. And often it's the Abrahamic faiths that are fighting with each other and persecuting each other's lack of freedom in one country, or saying, well, we're better than you are. And we believe that we're right and you're wrong, and you're worthy to be locked up or killed because you don't agree with me. And these all are faiths that descend from the same person. We could, as they could, as religious leaders, all stand in front of the tomb of Abraham and claim common heritage with this one person, and then killing each other. This is maddening. This should not happen. And there's a group now of theologians, of high-level Abrahamic faith theologians, coming together and saying, no, we will stand up for each other's right to religious freedom or belief. And this is an important initiative for religious leaders to do this and to send that message around the world, that we'll stand up for each other's faith. And you have a right to your faith. And I will respect, I'll even care for you. And hopefully I'd love to see the day when we say, and I love you too, in spite of our differences theologically. I love you as a common human being, as one that declares a descendancy from Abraham. And I look forward to that day of that common heritage of, as Martin Luther King Jr. would say, of that community of man bonding together in a noble cause. So thank you all for being on this call and a part of this. I'm delighted actually that we do now commemorate this day because it's so needed and there's so much going on around the world. You can name it, and we've heard it and mentioned of different places, whether it's North Korea or China or what we're seeing in Pakistan or what we're seeing taking place in Nigeria, and just unfortunately a number of different countries around the world. Even right now, we have both the Tibetan situation and the Xinjiang situation happening in China, the persecution of the Tibetan Buddhists and the Uyghur Muslims that's in concentration camps. And we need to push back aggressively against those and declare that these are wrong. And these individuals, regardless of where they live, have this fundamental right to choose their own religious leaders, their religious thought, and their own religious way, peacefully. Thank you all for being on this call. Let's not just make it a commemoration, let's make it an action to where we move forward as a global community at the local level, at the national level, to establish this fundamental human rights for all. God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Brownback, and thank you for reminding us about our common humanity that we need to stand up for, and about the importance of grassroots movements and all the initiatives that you mentioned that we can get involved in our different capacities. And now I'd like to give the floor to Professor Ahmed Shahid, professor from Essex Law School and UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion of Belief. Professor Shahid, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Evelina. I thank Lord Alton and the Coalition for Genocide Response for inviting me to speak at this event today. It's indeed an honor to join such a distinguished lineup of speakers at this important occasion. The speeches we just heard, many ways sobering, but in many ways also inspiring in terms of the call to action that is so needed in this space. It is less than 18 months since the UN General Assembly adopted, with the co-sponsorship of dozens of states from around the world, Resolution 73296, designating 22nd August as a day to commemorate victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief. Moreover, today, 21st August, is the third commemoration of the International Day of Remembrance of Victims of Terrorism. As we consider the overlap between the victims we commemorate, The urgency of confronting these parallel interlinked global threats is self-evident. Ending the murder and the massacre of civilians based on their ethnic, racial, or religious affiliations, the forcible displacement of ethnic and religious communities, and the brutal sexual and gender-based violence suffered by victims are among the most profound challenges of our time. Most people agree that religions are neither inherently violent nor peaceful, but that human interpretations of religions or beliefs and the actual practices can lead them in either direction. And what both history and our contemporary experiences make clear that the failure to safeguard the human rights of all persons to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion or belief significantly undermines international peace, security, and development. Thus, in commemorating victims of violence based on religion or belief, my attention and efforts are directed towards implementation of states' binding obligations under international law to protect the human right to freedom of religion or belief of all persons. It is through the promotion and protection of human rights that we guarantee that these grave crimes and atrocities will end. Protecting human rights is principally the task of national governments. In many cases, however, restrictions on religious freedom and denials of that freedom stem not from governmental action, but from non-state actors. The catalogue of harrowing crimes just highlighted by Lord Alton and others evidences this. Violent extremism in the name of religion or belief is global and growing. Terrorist groups such as the Daesh or ISIL, Al-Qaeda, and Boko Haram transcend national boundaries to destabilize entire regions. Mob violence, often driven and justified by sectarian divisions and hatred, is frequently used as a means of enforcing religious or social norms, sometimes with deadly consequences. This month, we soberly remember that it is 6 years since the Yazidi community suffered a genocidal campaign of killings, rape, enslavement, and abductions at the hands of the Daesh. Thousands of Christians, Shia, and Kakai minorities have been killed or are missing and have had their lives devastated. State authorities must protect individuals and groups against discrimination and violence that violate the rights of persons based on their religion or belief. Additionally, an emerging consensus asserts that non-state actors, especially in situations where armed or terrorist groups exercise effective control over territorial population, must also comply with human rights principles and standards. In this regard, I commend the steps Lord Alton and his eminent colleagues are taking in pushing for accountability for violence based on gender belief, including at the International Criminal Court, the ICC. We know that crimes against humanity and genocides are not spontaneous. They're often the result of discrimination and state-sanctioned hatred fostered in permissive environments where individuals first spread fear, then hatred for material or political gain. While many people don't care to hide their faces of hatred, most people hide behind the anonymity and impunity offered today by social media platforms. A few moments ago, I and several other colleagues of mine issued a statement to express solidarity with victims of acts of violence based on gender belief. In that we asserted, and I quote, "We are concerned that states may also use religion as a means of shaping and reinforcing narrow concepts of national identity or violating other human rights and undermining gender equality." Previous speakers have referred to some of these cases. In Myanmar, we have seen the state stoke exclusionary nationalist ideologies that fuel violence against religious minorities. It is 3 years since the most significant wave of military-led violence against the Rohingya in Myanmar, resulting in the largest forced displacement in Asia since the Vietnam War. The atrocities continue. Rohingyas face forced labor, gender-based violence, and numerous human rights violations. Kachin Christians and Shan Buddhists also report being subjected to brutal violence. In China, as we heard, new evidence reveals that the widespread forcible sterilization for Uyghur women between the last 5 years have possibly plummeted the population growth by up to 84%, a staggering amount. In my capacity as UN Special Rapporteur, I've consistently urged states to operationalize tools directed towards the implementation of the right to freedom of religion or belief and building social capital and resilience among societies. These include Human Rights Council Resolution 1618 and its action plan on combating intolerance. The UN's plan of action against hate speech, again, offers practical roadmaps for implementation. And indeed, Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, with its tagline of leaving no one behind, also offers a blueprint that can create social capital and resilience against hatred and discrimination. On this day, we seek to honor the victims of acts of violence. It is imperative, therefore, that states invest more effort and resources to support victims, secure access to justice, and remedies including rehabilitation, restitution, and guarantees of non-recurrence. I wish to endorse the statement made by Lord Ahmed that the ultimate test of, I think, one's credibility is how far we're willing to stand up for the rights of somebody else to have their religious belief. I also want to endorse the call by Ambassador Sam Brownback, who's been great things to support the cause here, for his call to have at two levels, a global level and a grassroots level movement to ensure that everyone can enjoy their right to freedom of their belief. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shahid. Thank you very much for reminding us about the importance to implement states' obligations to protect and promote human rights for all, and also for reminding us about the need to invest in assisting victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief, ensuring justice, providing survivors with rehabilitation, and other assistance that they may need. And also thank you very much for reminding us that genocide and crimes against humanity are not spontaneous. They don't just happen, which of course means that we should be able to identify the early warning signs and be able to prevent them from occurring in the future. And now I would like to give the floor to Professor Maris Tadros from the Coalition for Religious Equality and Inclusive Development, Institute of Development Studies, University of Sussex. Professor Tadros, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Evelina, and thank you very much for inviting me. It is a great privilege and honor to be here, and I want to take up the challenge that Lord Ahmed mentioned. We must take back the narrative. Very briefly, when Lord Ahmed mentioned a UK initiative on freedom of religion or belief that the UK government is supporting, CREED, the Coalition for Religious Equality and Inclusive Development, this is a coalition that is convened by IDS, but that involves faith and non-faith actors across the globe. We're working primarily in 6 countries, and we are working on how do we bring freedom of religion or belief into sustainable development and humanitarian work. And I speak from the perspective of evidence that has been gathered from development practitioners, activists, and others in many of the countries in which we work, that has sought to make visible the invisible. Because in order for us to take back the narrative, we need to be able to recognize violence when it happens. Unfortunately, what I am going to be engaging with today is a form of violence that is so invisible, that is so insidious, that in many of the communities in which it is being experienced by religious minorities, it's not even recognized as such. I want to start speaking a little bit about sexual grooming. Now, you are all very familiar with the term sexual grooming. This has nothing to do with religion per se. We know that sexual grooming involves predators that target girls and women, and sometimes boys, who are vulnerable because of economic deprivation, personal hardship, harsh family circumstances, while suffering from all kinds of exclusions. And these predators can be of faith or no faith. They exist across the globe, in countries of the global south, as well as in the West. They are of any age, of any ethnicity, of any background. And dare I say, we also have a minority of cases of women who are sexual predators and who target young boys. We know that globally, sexual grooming occurs when predators target girls and women because of their intersecting vulnerabilities. But what I am going to suggest today is that there's a particular kind of sexual grooming which is ideologically motivated and which targets women who belong to religious minorities because they belong to these religious minorities. And the aim of this kind of sexual grooming, which is not only to exert a kind of power, a very horrid kind of power, as we see in sexual grooming, whether of an individual or collective case. It is also ideological in the sense that it targets women who belong to religious minorities, who also suffer from intersecting vulnerabilities, but who also are being targeted because the intent is to cause psychological hardship to the religious minority, to break the religious minority. It's almost like what Lord Ahmed has been talking about in previous initiatives on the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. This is the use of sexual grooming to target women and in their own words, quote unquote, conquer women as a way of conquering and exerting a very harmful sense of shame and loss for religious minorities, but also as a way of gradually changing the demography of these religious minorities by bringing these women into the fold of the religious majority. So it is part of an ideological project intended to homogenize society. And we see very, very clear examples of this from our own research. We see that, for example, in India, in 2017, the Hindu Jagran Manch announced that it would facilitate the marriage of around 2,100 Muslim women who wish to marry Hindu men, and that they will support them financially and provide security. Now, this is not a case of a Hindu organization believing in free love or believing in the right of individuals to choose partners independently of their faith. This is part of a political project that has been widely publicized, which is to seek to convert into Hinduism Muslim women and Christian women. And when we look at their literature, they are saying very specifically that they are training Hindu men to lure Muslim women into through gifts, through claims that they will respect their religion, that they won't have to change, etc., etc., in order to create a psychological web around these women and then forcibly convert them into Hinduism. And then, of course, there is a case of forced marriage. We also see that the Pakistani Human Rights Commission, in noting the way in which Hindu women and Christian women were targeted, very poor Hindu and Christian women were targeted. And we know here that there's also the element of caste playing a role, intersecting with poverty, intersecting with gender, that the targeting, the ideologically motivated targeting of Christian and Hindu women into cases of forced marriage and then forced conversion, that the evidence that this is very much based on the targeting of girls was seen according to the Pakistani Human Rights Commission, when we see that when girls converted to Islam, it was celebrated that when Hindu boys converted, they were forced into destitution. I want to go back to why they would do this. Again, it is about homogenizing society, and it is about the psychological damage that it causes religious minorities when girls disappear, and when then they announce their faith as if it is of their free will. I'm not saying that every case of interfaith marriage in Pakistan or in India or in Egypt or in Nigeria or in many of the other cases in which we've noted ideologically motivated sexual grooming is one that is not of free will. But what I'm saying is we see a pattern, and this pattern is very dangerous. And one of the things we've noted is that in countries where it is not ideologically motivated, in other words, where sexual grooming is driven by sexual predation, eventually we hope that when these gangs or groups of sexual groomers or individuals, when they are caught, that the legal system, the police force, is in a position to get justice for the victims. In many of these countries, justice is impossible. So in many of the countries that we have noted cases of ideologically motivated sexual grooming, the case is that there's a complicity of the police in allowing these cases to happen, which emboldens those with this political agenda to continue. In other words, when families report their missing daughters and they say, we are not aware that a marriage proposal was presented to us by the person that they were seeing, or that the girl has indicated a keenness on getting married, and that she's disappeared in very exceptionally unusual circumstances. The police say it's not our problem, it's not our case. The other issue is that when these very poor families go and they try and raise the issue to the judiciary, these families are terrorized. We have cases of Hindu women in Pakistan being told, your younger daughter will be next. It won't be just the one we've captured, and your other daughters will be next. We also know that because of patriarchal norms and values in these societies, if these women are subjected to sexual violence by these men as part of the, in the process of them being groomed, if they have been raped or sexually assaulted, or photos of them taken on their groomers' mobile, and they're scared these photos will be circulated, they're feeling such shame. They're so worried that their families would blame them that they just say, well, I'm willing to be married, or I'm willing to convert, because they are so terrified of the consequences of having been the subjects of sexual violence or violently pornographic material being taken of them. So what can be done? Well, the first thing is we need to recognize we need to recognize ideologically motivated sexual grooming for what it is. This is the biggest challenge. It is such a challenge because I just want to give you a comparator of what this kind of challenge means. The comparator I will draw on is in the 20th century, when women who were victims of rape had to explain to judges that when they froze and when they couldn't open their mouth to say no, this did not mean yes. That when they went to be with a man to accompany him in a place or a venue, and they thought that the motives were honorable, that they couldn't have foreseen rape, that this did not mean that they wanted rape. I think this is the comparator I want to draw to say that a lot of these women, because they were victims of sexual grooming that involved at the very early stages gifts and promises that each person will keep to his or her religion, that they will come as formal suitors to their family eventually, and so forth. Once they are entrapped, they are so scared that no one will believe them. And to be honest, I'm saying this with extreme pain. One of the cases that I encountered was I was trying to raise this issue with a pioneering human rights organization working in Egypt that works on victims of violence and trauma. And when I said to them, since you're working on the rights of people who disappear, why don't you look at the cases of the disappearing Coptic women? And their response to me was, well, no, because these women went of their own accord. So when the first step is that we need to recognize those patterns of sexual predation that we see in many countries where there is a homogenizing agenda happening. We need to recognize it for what it is. We need to name it. We need to be able to make visible the invisible. And dare I say, the only way we can do this is through everybody being able to work with the very poor, because they are the ones that are most subjected to this kind of sexual predation. And dare I also say that this is not just a woman's issue. This is a societal issue, because the initial intention was to break the religious minority, to make them feel dishonor, and to ultimately, in the long run, affect the demography, because once you convert, the offspring have to follow the religion of the majority. And Mr. Sam Brownback, Your Excellency, you mentioned a community of men. I'm afraid that's not enough anymore. That is a community that is deeply flawed and that has full of deficits. We need a community of women and men. We need a community of the poor and rich. We need a community where those that are on the very margins are recognized, and they're recognized with the intersection of the injustice they feel because they're women and because they're poor and because they belong to religious minorities all in there. We need a community of women and men in order for us to take this forward. Finally, I think Lord Alton and Evelina and everyone who has been working on the coalition to make genocide recognized by the British government, we need to also, after we get the recognition of ideologically motivated sexual grooming happening, then we need to press for accountability. And I think that would be the next phase, that accountability for the victims of ideologically motivated sexual grooming. But in the meantime, there are very practical measures that we need to press for. The first is to create accountable police forces in the countries in which this is happening, so that when complaints are received about disappearing girls, they are dealt with seriously and they are not ignored. The second measure is we need to afford the families and girls who have disappeared a safe and neutral haven once they have been subject to this, to protect the girls, sometimes from their own families. So we need safe refugees for the girls, but also sometimes safe refugees for the families, because they may be subject to terror and subject to threats that they will be punished for, as poor people, for seeking to have their daughter back. We also need to talk about laws, because in many of these countries, once you are forcibly converted into the religion of the majority, it is extremely difficult for you to be able to convert back to your original faith, and also for the legal system to recognize forced marriages, coerced marriages. I'm bringing to your attention again the example of rape, when we had to get judges and the judiciary to recognize that just because women were not psychologically in a case to say no, it didn't mean that it was a yes. The same thing here, the conditions under which marriages happen have to be taken very seriously, so that women are not in a situation where, because of internalized social norms and values, they are feeling that they are not victims because they dared to accept a gift, or they dared to believe that a suitor will marry them and offer them a better chance in life while allowing them to stay in their own religion, which is obviously not the case. So it is a long journey ahead. We have a paper coming out in September that provides detailed evidence on this phenomenon. In the meantime, there is a short paper that we've published today on this phenomenon. We also have a number of podcasts that we have from our partners in Myanmar and elsewhere that we are going to be sharing with you on our website on the theme of gender-based violence. Very many apologies for having taken so long, and thank you again for your attention.
Thank you very, very much, Maris, for shedding light on the issue of ideologically motivated sexual grooming that often targets religious minorities. And this is definitely a topic that requires further attention, and we look forward to reading the paper. And now I would like to give the floor to Nadine Maenza, Commissioner with the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you to the Coalition for Genocide Response for the invitation to be part of this special event, and to all my distinguished panelists for their very important remarks. As many of you know, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom is an independent bipartisan government agency, and our mandate is to assess religious freedom conditions abroad and make recommendations to the President, the Secretary of State, and to Congress. We don't consider the bilateral relationship with other countries and the factors when we make our decisions. We have 9 commissioners of both political parties appointed by the President and the leaders of Congress, and a professional staff of about 20. So I'm going to share some of our recommendations and findings with you. Mass atrocity crimes, which include genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, often target the most vulnerable groups, which oftentimes is minority and religious communities. Mass atrocities can also be committed in the name of religion or belief. In the lead up to these atrocities, if you've already heard, religious freedom is often violated in less severe ways, but there are some indications that these crimes could be coming. When these crimes occur, states have an obligation under international law to see that those responsible are held accountable through criminal prosecutions, because accountability can deter future abuse and promote reconciliation and harmony. The investigation and prosecution of mass atrocities is fundamental in societies dealing with the legacy of conflict. Victim participation in criminal processes can also help prosecutors discover the truth and empower victims to share their stories. This becomes more complicated, of course, when those responsible are nation states. Several priority countries for USURF include Burma, Iraq, Northeast Syria, Nigeria, Central African Republic, have recently experienced mass atrocities directed at religious communities with ongoing accountability processes at the domestic and the international level. The U.S. government's prioritization of religious freedom must include a commitment to holding accountable perpetrators of mass atrocities committed against religious communities. The U.S. State Department's Office of Global Criminal Justice, working in concert with the Bureau of Democracy, Rights, and Labor, and the International Religious Freedom Office, with Ambassador Brownback, can play an important role in ensuring the perpetrators of those horrific crimes can see their day in court, including by publicly supporting the investigation of such crimes, providing documentation to support those prosecutions, providing technical assistance to build the capacity of those domestic courts, and funding domestic and hybrid tribunals. The U.S. government's engagement in these criminal processes can also help to garner support from other countries and affirm the international community's collective commitment to justice and accountability. And the U.S. government can also impose targeted financial sanctions and visa restrictions against these known perpetrators to prevent and deter future abuses under the Global Magnitsky Act. On August 25th, 2017, the Burmese military launched a genocidal campaign that has already been talked about today under the cover of targeting insurgents in the Rakhine State. The United States, the U.S. State Department, and human rights advocates have documented instances of Burmese military units involved in indiscriminate killing of civilians, mass rape, and other atrocities. More than 700,000 Rohingya civilians fled to refugee camps in Bangladesh. I personally was able to interview survivors during visits to Burma and to Bangladesh last year. And I've learned the only way that they will return to Burma is if conditions in the Rakhine State change and those officials responsible for their persecution are held accountable. In December of 2019, the U.S. Department of Treasury enacted targeted sanctions against 4 senior Burmese military officers due to their responsibilities for atrocities in the Rakhine State and as well as the Chin State, including Commander-in-Chief Min Aung Hlaing, Deputy Commander-in-Chief So Wen, and the State Department also imposes visa bans against these individuals. USURF welcomes these decisions, as well as the United Kingdom's announcement in July of targeted sanctions against the 2 leaders I named. USURF also urges the European Union, Australia, Canada, and other governments to take similar actions to send a clear message that Burmese war criminals will not be welcome in the international community. The U.S. formally recognized ISIS atrocities against Yazidis, Christians, and Shia Muslims in Iraq and Syria that was committed in 2014 as genocide. In statements by the Secretary of States, both John Kerry in 2016 as well as Rex Tillerson in 2017, and also in the Iraq and Syria Genocide Relief and Accountability Act of 2018. It has since devoted millions of dollars, primarily through USAID, for humanitarian relief, reconstruction, rehabilitation for these devastated communities. Furthermore, the United States has continued to highlight international religious freedom as a key issue, including President Trump's executive order in June of 2020 that called it a, quote, moral and national security imperative and a foreign policy priority for the United States. It's important to note that the challenges facing victims of ISIS atrocities, particularly Yazidis Christians, are substantially and ongoing. For example, 6 long years after the genocide, the majority of displaced Yazidi families in Iraq, likely numbering around 200,000, still remain in IDP camps, prevented by dire security and infrastructure conditions in their homeland of Sinjar. USURF has urged the U.S. government to maintain pressure on the Iraqi government to implement its own stated policy to rein in the Iranian-aligned militias. Security must be addressed in order for Yazidis and Christians to be able to fully recover from this genocide. The Yazidi community has also been unable to account for 2,800 of the girls and women who ISIS abducted and enslaved. Justice, however, remains largely elusive for the victims of these atrocities and their families, in part due to Iraq's overwhelmed justice system and disagreements with the international community on the collection and use of evidence against these perpetrators. Meanwhile, in neighboring Syria, Turkey's successive invasions and occupation in the north and northeast since 2018 to the present have been disastrous for those very same vulnerable minorities who so much recently faced genocide under ISIS. In June, USCIRF held a hearing titled Safeguarding Religious Freedom in Northeast Syria, where we documented the remarkable religious freedom conditions in the autonomous administration of North and East Syria that has been a refuge for so many of these genocide survivors. Testimony at this hearing also documented the deteriorating conditions in the area Turkey has invaded. Currently, there are reports of killings, rapes, kidnapping, forced conversion, and destruction of religious sites, and even recent reports of arrests of Christians for apostasy. For this reason, USCIRF has recommended that the US government pressure Turkey to withdraw from Syria. In Nigeria, in 2013, the US designated Boko Haram a terrorist group under Executive Order 13224 and has enacted sanctions against key Boko Haram and ISIS West African leaders who've committed grave violations against Nigerians and others on the account of their beliefs. Christian and Muslim communities alike are targeted as infidels and apostates, with Boko Haram attacking communities, abducting and executing individuals based on their religious beliefs or their support for a more secular state. Boko Haram has killed more than 37,000 people since 2011 and displaced 2.5 million in its campaign to establish a caliphate and impose exclusive Islamic principles throughout the Lake Chad Basin. In the Central African Republic, the US government has shown its strong commitment to support the implementation of the February 2019 accord that brought an end to the 5-year conflict and widespread sectarian violence, included by recently enacting sanctions on BCD Soliman, a notorious armed group leader who continues to violate the agreement and commit human rights abuses against Central African civilians. The US government is also a key supporter of the Special Criminal Court, which was established in 2015 to seek justice and accountability for grave crimes committed in CAR since 2003. The US government provides financial, technical, and diplomatic support to this court, which has closed 8 cases since its inaugural session in 2018, and currently has 8 cases under investigation and 15 cases under preliminary examination. USCIRF is encouraged by the US government's aggressive use of the Global Magnitsky Act and other policy tools to target violators of religious freedom. However, now that the US policymakers have had several years using these tools, it would be helpful to evaluate how effective they have been in curtailing abuses and possible areas for reform. USCIRF recommends that Congress consider a permanent codification of the State Department's authority under its annual appropriations law to impose individual visa bans on gross human rights violations. In addition, Congress should be more clearly define the authority of the relationship with global Magnitsky sanctions. USCIRF also recommends that the US government continue to support justice efforts to ensure that perpetrators of atrocities committed against religious groups are held accountable. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Nadine, for reminding us about the needs of accountability and the need to assist domestic courts to build this capacity to investigate the atrocities, to prosecute the perpetrators, but also the need to sometimes establish an international tribunal or some kind of a hybrid tribunal to address the growing impunity if the domestic courts do not deal with those prosecutions. So thank you very much for this important contribution. And unfortunately, of course, we are running out of time. And from what I know, Lord Ahmed had to leave us at 5 o'clock to attend his next meeting. But if that's okay with all speakers, I would like to allow one question, and one very practical question in relation to how all attendees who are representing different organizations, they're also from religious communities, also from governments, from different civil society groups, how can they assist your work, your important work? And if that's okay, if we could start with Professor Ahmed Shahid, who is of course the UN Special Rapporteur, who often calls for evidence and information that will then inform his reports.
Thank you, Alina. In fact, you just hit the nail on the head. In my work, it's vitally important that I work with civil society actors and the key role they can play. Many roles they can play. One of the most important roles is documenting violations, ensuring that they get properly recorded and provide a basis upon which there can be some sort of redress remedy sought for the victims and accountability for perpetrators. Beyond that, of course, documenting patterns of violations is important. Patterns and trends also provide early warning in terms of what could happen next, and therefore enable various actors, including those within the UN system, to be better prepared to respond to those. But beyond that, there's also the more positive role one could say that they can play, and that is to build bridges among different groups, build societal resilience, as I call it, create networks of support in a positive sense to prevent things from happening, and therefore to empower individuals and to empower themselves. This is the key ways in which I think my mandate would work with various civil society actors working in this space. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if I could give the floor to Nadine Manza.
Sure, thank you. I also agree that documentation and sharing facts on the ground is so important, and we really count on that, certainly at the Commission, in order to make our recommendations. But we also appreciate civil society and those of you on social media and other platforms to be able to amplify the things that we're saying, and particularly to tell stories so that people understand what's happening. So much of the time, with so much information, it's hard sometimes for some of this to break through, but stories have a really important impact. Recently there was a man arrested and a friend for apostasy, a Christian, and the story about that, people telling that story really did help change the outcome of his case. So, those are some other ways that civil society can also support the work.
Thank you very much, Nadine. And I would like to give the floor to Maris. And of course, just wanted to mention, after the event, I will share the link to the paper that Maris mentioned earlier today, so that you can always have a look.
Thank you very much, Evelina, much appreciated. So very quickly, I think one of the challenges that we've experienced in working with communities is there is the evidence there, but they don't know how to present it in a way that international organizations would consider as credible, as robust. On the other hand, there's a dilemma because a lot of international organizations would tell them we will send our own people to investigate, and that can cause enormous harm and damage to the community to have an outsider go in. So what we do in our CREAT program is we build the capacity of local leaders, women and men, on how they can use very practical participatory research methods to gather the evidence necessary, and then we help them in filtering through, but everything is in their voice. So please, if you do have evidence on ideologically motivated sexual violence, but you don't know how to present it, we will not send our own researchers. We will build your own people on how to do this research, and you will present the data independently of us if you wish. But the point is, it allows you that space to do it in the way that is required for international practices, but through your own people. The second thing is, please use the term ideologically motivated sexual grooming. Use it on Twitter, use it in your articles, use it in your correspondence, use it on Facebook, because that is one way in which we can break the silence. One of the biggest challenges historically in the 20th century that we had is to break the silence about when women are raped when they are on dates, because people consider that was rape. And the same thing here, because ideologically motivated sexual grooming, like all other forms of sexual grooming, happens initially through consensus. In other words, a girl is given gifts that that she goes to places of her own accord. There isn't that element of overt violence. People then say, well, she went of her own accord. There is no violence there. She deserves what she got. So let us name things for what they are. Please use the term, circulate it, so that we then break the silence around it. The third thing, very, very quickly, is we must, for every single who's out there who has links to a faith or non-faith group, or who is part of a faith or non-faith group, where there is religious inequality in the broader community, we must strengthen the idea that women's worth is not in their sexual chastity, that women who are subjects of sexual violence are still complete human beings. Because if we change the gender norms within faith groups, in non-faith groups, regarding the value of women, the dignity of women, then women who do become victims of sexual grooming, ideological or otherwise, would not have those internalized norms of non-self-worth associated with their bodily integrity that comes in the way of them speaking up, of them not going ahead with a forced marriage and thinking that their futures are gone. Sorry to have taken time on this.
Thank you very much, Maris. And Of course, our time is running, and we cannot allow more time for further questions because, of course, our speakers also have other events to attend. It's a very busy period for them. But I would just wanted to briefly summarize the most important message that comes very clearly from all the statements that we had today. And this is that we need to do more to address acts of violence based on religion or belief, and starting with naming the atrocities for what they are, naming the crimes for what they are. But then, of course, by stopping them, assisting the survivors, ensuring justice, but also to making sure that those atrocities do not happen again. We need to make sure that the promise of never again is not an empty promise. I would like to say a big kudos to all speakers and thank also all attendees for joining us to mark the International Day commemorating the victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief. Please make sure that you mark this day again and again, and also make sure that any kind of recognition of and determination of acts of violence based on religion or belief follows with action. So we need to be very action oriented. And please stay in touch, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.